All right, guys, so 12:30, you want to go ahead and run the videos. Well, it's afternoon here, and so thank you and welcome to track 1, the environment, social, and governance track for better data insights, enabling companies' ESG goals to ultimately benefit society. So I'm your track producer, Robert Lutton, Vice President, Santel Consultants, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session called Data Traps and Treasure Hunts. So I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items for both our folks in the room and for folks that are online virtually. This session is being recorded. The presentations will be available to the Symposium attendees via the proceedings after the registration at no charge to you. So if you miss this session, please go back online. You'll be able to find all the details about it. The video recordings will be uploaded to the CDOIQ YouTube channel in 3 months after the symposium, so that way we entice people to come live and meet our speakers and things like that. There is a Q&A session and there is a poll session. So we'll walk through what we're looking to get out of the poll. So for our folks that are online, if you can please use the Q&A feature in the Whova app to submit your questions, and at the end, Simone and I will take questions from the audience and obviously then from the poll as well. This session does have a poll, so I'm not sure if some of you folks actually have the Whova app loaded on your smartphone. If you do, you might be able to action that as well, and we'll talk about that poll and how long we're going to leave it open. So today, I have the pleasure of introducing Simone Steele. Simone is the Chief Data and Analytics Officer from Nationwide Building Society UK. So Simone will talk about that in a minute. So a little bit of background information on Simone. Simone is a Chief Data and Analytics Officer, we just mentioned that, and is a leader for the data and analytics community. Before joining Nationwide in April 2020, she held leadership positions at Morgan Stanley, Refinitiv, I think it's Refinitiv, is it? Refinitiv, which is a spin-off of Thomson Reuters, and the Royal Bank of Scotland, with their risk and finance products and functions. Her experience in data and information technology extends for many years, we'll say, many years, right? And developed through software engineering, data architecture, and transformation of complex data systems. In the past 10 years, Simone has been focused on data and technology strategy definitions and digital businesses. Simone has worked in locations across Europe, Asia, and the Americas in a variety of industries, including financial services, technical communications, pharmaceuticals, consumer goods, technology, and data services. And finally, this is probably one of the most highlights that I get to highlight. Simone is an active ambassador for women and the BLAME professionals in data science and technology. Her academic background includes computing, economics, and data science. So, Simone, welcome.
This is an ominous room, so I wish you were sitting together so I didn't have to scan so much. But thank you very much for choosing to come to this session. And I'm really honored to be talking about my experience here with you. And to all of you who are online, I hope this is going to be useful for you as well. So thank you, Robert, for the introduction about me, my career, my background. I want to just position the business that I'm working in right now, especially to make a distinction between the Nationwide that most of you here in the US know as the insurance company, differentiating it from Nationwide, the building society, which is a bit like a credit union. It's a mutual enterprise. And as such, it's really appropriate for me to be speaking at the ESG track, because the mission for Nationwide is to put together people who save with people who need mortgages. It's for the flourishing financially and their family prosperity. And it's a social enterprise in its core. So for us, talking about environment, social, and governance responsibilities actually is completely aligned with our mission. We don't chase profitability, we don't chase growth regardless. It is all about supporting the communities where we operate. And we are a UK-only business and have been for 137 years now. And most people in the UK that hear about Nationwide, they would associate that with their parents and grandparents saving to buy a house. And at this point in time, we have over 17 million members. We call our customers members. They are the investors in this financial institution, and the returns, the profitability goes back to them. As a social enterprise, you can imagine then our ability to innovate is a little bit more limited than perhaps financial institutions that have different, more flexible business models on trading and other investments. So my experience here that I'm going to share with you has this context. It might be very different from yours, but as a data professional, I'm sure some will resonate with you. And for my own selfish needs now, what I wanted to do is to run a poll, not just with this room, but with our attendees online, and keep this poll running for the entirety of the event in case others that are listening to the recording or watching the recording would like to also help me sense where we are as chief data officers and data leaders. So Robert, can you push the poll and Hoover?
Maybe I can add into that.
Okay.
So the poll is actually live now, it's open, so on the Hoover app. So Simone's going to talk about the various options, but the poll will remain open until the end of the symposium. At that time, we'll close it and then send you the results. So the poll is now open. To get to it, where the Q&A is in your Hoover session, right next to it, you'll see polls. Click on that and go ahead and enter your selection. So Simone, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, my intent wasn't to distract you, so it is going to be open for the duration of the event. And my objective with this is to really get a sense of what are the impediments to utilizing data and everything else that we see as benefit from it in your organization, in your context. What is the biggest challenge? And I volunteered a few challenges of my own, which is to give away a little bit of the presentation too. And some of them were touched upon by the speakers on this track if you have been here in the morning. Executive support. It has been spoken about time and time again as necessary. But how big is that challenge for you? The understanding of data responsibilities as data citizens in an organization. How mature is that? We talk about data literacy, data culture, but how mature is that understanding in how people do their work? And even if you are lucky enough to be literate and have a culture that values data, how ready are the business partners that you work with in actually using those insights? Oftentimes, you might actually work really hard to get those insights, and that they go with their gut feel, or they had already made a decision. So if the data disproves their opinion, it might be discarded. There were speakers as well talking about silos, functional silos, business silos, swim lanes that never interchange, and is that preventing really data from being valuable to your business and society? Do we have financial support for the Chief Data and Analytics Officer business? Or is it still seen as an optional, perhaps something you need to compete with technology to get funding for? And the perspective here that data is somebody else's problem. So is it a back office function where you are? Is it really more than that cost center? Is it part of your business, is intertwined with the results? So these are some of the challenges that I thought would be interested to put in the poll, but there are others. Yeah, we talked this morning about attracting talent, retention, many other challenges. So please do engage with the poll, if not now, later on throughout the event. So in the introduction, I'm actually going to make an excuse for my own bias here. So in the introduction, Robert called out some of my professional background in technology. He also covered some of my academic background that goes from computing, in those days was called data processing, isn't that ironic, to financial services through economics and statistics and onto data science. And predominantly, I'm going to be talking here from a slightly biased position in retail financial services, even though my experience covers a lot of investment companies globally in the financial sector. And why all those excuses? Is because a 135-year-old retail UK-only business might not be the thing you relate to. But hopefully the human patterns that come with a business that is 15,000 employees strong might be useful to you as well. And this is a little bit of an homage for any of my Brazilian friends that might be online or here in the audience. You might not recognize, unless you are from Brazil, this aerial picture of the river Solimões and the river Negro, the two rivers that form the Amazon River. Yeah, so those two rivers come together hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the sea where it ends. And the waters of the two rivers, the muddy waters of the Solimões and the dark waters of the Negro, don't mix for literally hundreds of thousands, hundreds of miles, as you can see in terms of length of the river. But if you look at the fractal patterns of how they intertwine but not quite mix, is hundreds of thousands of miles. And this is my data context right now. Is it a business domain? Is it a technology domain? Why does it need to be this or the other? Is it both? Doesn't quite resonate with anybody, because if it's both, it's like the dog with the two owners that never gets fed. And so the presentation also covers a little bit about identity. How is data perceived in the organization? Perception is half the battle here. And for Nationwide, now building society, for Nationwide, we are at a point where some financial institutions have started to pull away from us. So we are playing catch up with companies that have been more software-based or have embraced more than just the digital interface with the customers. Because, let's be honest, if you don't have a nice website, if you don't have a lot of mobile features in your app, and if you can't do fast payments or you can't do whatever, you would be out of business by now. But if you look inwards, we are still struggling to be digital ourselves. Some businesses in retail finance have found more efficiencies because they may have had shareholder pressure more than we have had pressure from our own customers and members of this society. We are also struggling with a new challenge. So how are we proficient in handling data? As an old financial institution, it is culturally acceptable or even culturally demanded that we rely on people's expertise to form an opinion, to validate how our businesses are running, how the businesses are running, the various different business trends, and the distrust or mistrust in data as a profession, as a set of techniques, as a set of technologies, is still very much present. So that's a new challenge for us. And for me, the new opportunities, I want to discuss a little bit, maybe towards the end of today, what should the Chief Data Officer be doing to propel this business on a more data-driven and data-led way. And I had one question in the Hoover platform before coming in today. And I'm not sure if it was a real question or just a cheeky question, but it was about, treasures. What treasures? What are you looking for when you talk about data treasures? And it was kind of a revelation for me because I thought everybody was looking for the same thing. So that is the danger of assumptions. Treasure for me and for Nationwide is to use data for the benefit of our society, our building society, our members. And right now we are not. We are using data to stay in business. Right? So we are doing, what feels right and what needs to be legally right and actually fulfill the transactions correctly and finance that property correctly. But that's not for the benefit, the delight of our members. It's not going above and beyond what other financial institutions can do and are doing. So for me, the treasure is this elusive value from data. Where is it? And I'm centering this presentation around that theme because it conjures those images that I'm looking for in our business when I go back to Nationwide, which are things that are buried or things that are hidden that have intrinsic value, but you cannot prove until you find it, until you clean it up, and hopefully remove some toxicity from it, and actually use that effectively. So the theme is also very important for me, and that's why I talked about my background in computing. As software engineers, it is much more common to talk about patterns and anti-patterns so that we don't fall into the same traps of algorithms that have intrinsic design flaws. And that thinking about patterns and anti-patterns, I think are useful. The thinking itself is useful for chief data officers and data leaders. What are the behaviors that actually impede your progress towards finding those treasures? So the structure for me is quite simple in my mind, right? What are the things that I encountered as I joined Nationwide 2 years ago that on the surface look like the right thing, that people were saying the right thing? And when I say people, it could be the executives, your business partner, your colleagues. What were they saying that looked and sounded like a data strategy? So the first thing I encountered is a wave of support. And I thought, well, that's brilliant. Right? This is really good. They get data, it's actually carrying a lot of potential, and they are ready to support me to unleash this mysterious value. And there's the list as long as my arm of expressions that had been used, from data is the new oil, which I think I should change the presentation to the new oxygen or something a little less ESG harming. Yes, let's manage our data like an asset. Like I know, I think Douglas Lane is going to talk again in this year's symposium. And the first time I hear him talk about infonomics and I read his book, I was surprised with my own ignorance of what it takes to manage an asset. Like not just the strategy that I put here. Yeah, let's manage it like an asset. Do I have an asset tag? Do I depreciate it? Do I have it in my balance sheet? And the story goes, right? And also, like, I know to leverage some big data technology. That this is like my stakeholders' most precious contribution to the data strategy. Let's get some technology in there. And I came to recognize how damaging this is, and that's why I called it an anti-pattern. It is damaging because it creates a chasm between what the executive team, and sometimes the non-executive board of directors, that's how they communicate that they are on board with this new era of data-driven businesses. Yeah, so it's a bit of reassurance that, yes, everybody's saying that it's an asset. Of course it has to be an asset. It's going to be an asset for us. And then there is a chasm, and the 135-year-old organization that has amalgamated 250 building societies over the last century and a bit, that has quite a lot of heavy lifting by people of its processes and data controls. So I thought it was damaging as an anti-pattern because it fails to recognize that by saying it, you are making a statement that you don't know how far you are from implementing, even if you knew what you're saying. The second important anti-pattern for me over the last 2 years has been this centralization is the simplification of a complex adaptive system into the hands of one owner and one kind of problem space, one domain, if you will. So the issues magnet, as I call this anti-pattern, is to reduce a problem that is about data citizenship. How does everybody create and consume data? And everything that can go wrong because of the lack of that citizenship onto a program of remediation in the back office. Yeah, so data ownership being in the hands of the CDO doesn't make it any easier or any harder to resolve. Hopefully it makes it easier because at least you can have the dialogue and you have the conversation and you move perhaps intellectually the topic forwards. But actually doesn't resolve the issue of good discipline and data hygiene. It tries to push ownership into people. And I'm not quite sure in other industries if this is a common structure. But data ownership in financial services is written down in regulation. Yeah, so for some risk aggregation regulation like BCBS 239 or even GDPR alludes to data ownership being clear in the organization. What does it mean if you're flying blind and you actually don't know where your data is and how it's moving? It translates into avoidance of ownership across the organization and bringing this ownership onto a central place that has been quite damaging. Yeah, so the problems then become somebody else's problem, not the organization's problem. Flying blind, I mentioned ever so slightly that what people think they know is not necessarily what they observe in a real world of how data supports the operation. So decisions are still made on the basis of this is how the problem is modeled, this is how the business flow is documented, this is what the process flow and the controls are saying to me about the quality of this data. But it's not really the observable data. And data inflation. And I don't think I need to, and now I'm looking at this data inflation everywhere I go, right? So I asked one of my younger kids for what they wanted for Christmas a few Christmas ago. And I was expecting a little bit a card like this saying, you know, whatever game and whatever toy. And at the end of like maybe what felt like 1 minute, I started to receive pictures from eBay and Amazon that he has taken from his iPad and airdropped to my iPhone. So that was the Christmas list, right? And here I am thinking, I just want a piece of paper with 2 sentences on it. I don't want like 2 megabytes worth of pictures in your iPad, down in my iPad, and in both of our iCloud backups, right? So my 2 Lego thing and whatever Robux have become like 8 megabytes in a blip. So this is happening in the organization, right? It's happening in front of our very eyes when the business silos decide that they have to have a database, and then they send the data, which is identical, to the next station, like in a manufacturing thing, right? Send the data, but they're not sending the data, right? We are copying the data. And then we have our poor colleagues that look after operational resilience, because they are backing this stuff up every day, at least to a retention of 7 days for critical processes. And this stuff is just growing and growing ad infinitum. So these issues are very conveniently hovering around the magnet of the chief data officer location, whatever that might be in your organization. So yes, it is empowering to say, you know, this is how important your role is here. But it completely reverses the tide on what a chief data officer could be doing to get more value out of data. It turns into a problem space. And the third point that I consider an anti-pattern, a trap, is when we look at mental models that served us up to now and think that these mental models are going to serve us going forward. And first thing is the expertise of this mental model of expertise. So I'm not quite sure how many of you have come into finance and left finance, but usually there is a whole school of thought that embraces people that have already come from finance. So there is this industry culture which is very embraced and very accepted, which then leads us to miss solutions that come from the ecosystem, from manufacturing, from aerospace, from pharmaceuticals, from racing teams, from you name it. Data is seen in a finance institution as a finance domain. And actually, we understand that the good things and bad things that can happen with data, like privacy violation, are not exclusive to us. So there is a little bit of of making the problem fit the person who can solve it. Is the hammer looking for a nail? And it goes from executives all the way from specialists in savings. Yeah, and this uber specialism is hindering our progress as data professionals, because you bump into subject matter experts and key person dependencies everywhere you go. And those specialists may not be very comfortable revealing how far they need to go to start to talk to the other professional in the data space. So there is this language barrier that I believe has risen out of insular functions and insular business. And one of the examples I wanted to call out is how data in Nationwide has come from, it has come from 3 different places. Yeah, so in 2014-15, this data and analytics community was created. And it was made out of business intelligence specialists that worked in finance, a little bit from business intelligence professionals that worked with the front office, right? So the business generating revenues, and a little bit from technology. So those paradigms of what is the data problem we are trying to solve, or what is the data potential we are trying to go after, actually had completely different pictures depending where you came from. So much so that if we say, I need a data engineer, and then the software engineer will say, yes, I'm here. But not understanding, for example, that a data product is fundamentally different than a software product in its life cycle, in its accessibility, in its management of production workloads, it's a handicap, right? Data scientists being seen as end users that shouldn't really be touching proper technology, right? Maybe they can play around with Python or some S3 buckets and do kind of cool things like that. But no, you cannot touch my production environment. Yeah, so there are too many inherited perceptions of the data world that need to come together. And if they don't, they manifest themselves as this wrong solution to that problem. So these are the three anti-patterns that I found most profound, most, and the strongest in impeding process. And I started to look for something that was more akin to the treasure, right? So how can I counteract, how can I balance or instill different behaviors in an organization that is 15,000 people strong? And simply, I started to stop people dead on their tracks if they came to me to ask for some more value from data, or any of those strategy by slogans, anti-patterns I mentioned before. Yeah, so let's manage data as an asset actually needs to be confronted with what's the business question? What is the value for you? What do you mean by value? And what do you mean by extracting it from data, right? It's not kind of torturing it out of data somehow. How can I turn that dialogue into, let's look at the raw material you have to answer that business question? And the business question, by the way, could be what new products should be thinking now with high levels of inflation. How do we support our membership? That could be a business question. Or a business question could be, how do we support a member that comes into one of our branches that has just been a victim of fraud? Yeah, so that is what I'm talking about, business question here. What's your raw material and what's your product? In what form, in what data form should your product be? It could be an answer real time as that person comes in and you know they have called the complaints line and you know their card has been cloned, something of that sort. Or it could be more of a predictive set of data outcomes when we see that one of our members is going into persistent debt. Yeah. So turning from those massive, ambitious, and great goals of managing data as a new, as an asset to something really concrete, as uncomfortable as it might be in the moment, is a behavior that has helped. The other behavior that is extremely helpful is to deal in specifics about how data is flowing through my production line. So my production line here, I'm visualizing it as very much a manufacturing paradigm where, to fulfill one request from a member, how many workstations is that request going through and how much data is being pulled through to get that response correctly and aggregated it in the right way and risk managing in the right way. So instead of having that imaginary view of how your business is running, how can I get data to show my partners, my executives, my team members, how is the data really flowing? And one of the presenters just before lunch was talking about sensors in kind of industrial settings, right? Is this container about to burst, or is this pipe getting rusty? And those sensors in the digital world are much easier to implement. Yeah, so we have log files being produced, left, right, and center. We have metadata spilling out of our processes that we are not using. And that, for me, is to counteract the flying blind and the issues magnet Let's show where the problem really is. Let's walk the production floor. Let's visit the gemba, right? Let's visit where things are done, not look at the problems from an ownership point of view. Let's see where ownership should really land. And then optimize, right? This is really simple because it's easy to be asked and to respond to an ROI request. You know, what's your business case for doing something? And go straight into automation or straight into AI or straight into what the solutions should be. I would encourage, in any case, let alone on this one, that we should spend much more time understanding the problem and actually backing it up with facts and data. And lastly, mostly to do with the skills misfit that I encounter all the time, including mine. That's why I declare my bias. You know, my bias is definitely software engineering. And even if I have spent the last 20-odd years in financial services, I don't consider myself a finance professional. I consider myself a data and technology professional. So we all have our moments of self-selection and where our mental models are rigid. And I think in this case, leaders have to go first and show that we are always learning. But here, again, you chose to be here, right? Physically or online, you have selected to continue to learn. You have selected to keep a growth mindset rather than fixed mindset. But if you need to influence maybe 100 managing directors or 1,000 directors in your organization, especially the ones that are global, that might be here as well, you can imagine how hard that is to be done at scale. So leaders go first, and I'm hoping to always role model that passion for learning, for listening to other experiences. And once we can get a little bit more excitement, not just from a data professional cohort, but from our marketing officers, from our finance officers, from our HR partners, to get to understand that data management is not it is not waving of the wand, and it's not mysterious art, right? That happens somewhere with data clever people, right? It happens every day, and it happens very much. I think maybe some of you that worked in the 80s for small companies, you used to walk into your office space, and the security person would know you, right? And say, "Oh, hi," and you just walk in. And then they've introduced maybe security passes. And then they introduced electronic security pass. So you can't just show it, you touch it, and then you go through the turnstile or what have you, right? The same for data. We don't have the data skills and the discipline to treat it as again, as an asset or whatever it is that you treat, however it is that you treat your data. So we don't have habits. We don't have hygiene. We don't have code of conduct in our contracts. You may have some, most people now have clauses that do not permit you to reveal any material non-public information or treat your documents with confidentiality for the documents that are labeled, there might not be all, and things like that. But it is not how we do things here towards data. When I come in, imagine if I remove the copy-paste button, because say, okay, my policy says we are not copying data anymore, right? We are now going to the source. So if I remove the metaphorical copy-paste functionality and put into my code of conduct, you shall not replicate information that is not owned by you. What would happen? So data management, those disciplines of keeping it healthy so that we can use it for machine learning, for example, so that we can derive the best outcome for our members, for example, is essential discipline in the organization. So no more making do with borrowing an engineer here, borrowing a data specialist there, and then thinking that magic will appear. We now need to talk about fit for purpose. So these are few things a few things that I thought were useful to start then practicing kind of what I think the insights have been. And to do that, the first thing, obviously, there are certain things you can never stop doing, right? So let's say talk to the executives about what is the right business question is not something that we do once and don't do anymore. It's like customer satisfaction. You have to do it all the time. Things like development of skills, you have to do all the time. But the middle bit, the actual X-ray of your business process, is something that I found was a little bit more finite, and I could get cracking with an experimentation. With an experiment, rather. So this is an abstract process for anything. It could be how complicated it is to answer a phone call from one of our members that requires some investment advice. What we normally do is we look at the boxes and say, who is doing that activity in the box? Or what is that system that is doing that thing? Yeah, so these are mental models. Usually they are persisted in exactly this way, right? With flowcharts or some version of it. But actually what's happening in between those boxes is what I want to unveil more. These are the data raw materials, the data products that are flowing through these workstations. So first thing, what is getting translated? And maybe it's a bit too small that to see a Japanese A and a Roman A. But what is happening in between those places that potentially are in different parts of the organization? What is happening automatically in terms of checks and balances to make sure the system is healthy, quote unquote? And when it's not happening automatically, what are the handshakes? What are literally the email signatures that I need to put on an attestation document to say, yes, my system is working well, I'm attesting to it? Collecting all that systemic data is what we are embarking on at Nationwide. I call it the X-ray on our processes because it is, I am very conscious that it's not going to detect all sorts of tissues, all sorts of bones, all sorts of other systems, right? It would detect a few things more than others. But I think visualizing what the production line really is via the interconnections, not just the boxes, but the lines and what's happening in the lines, is what's going to open a dialogue at Nationwide to be more purposeful in its ESG commitments. And I'm only saying this with the ESG focus because there is an environmental impact, not of the properties we mortgage, because we are very aware of that, nor about our supply chain, because I don't know, last time you checked, nobody publishes a bad ESG rating on their website, right? So, oh, everybody's so green and so progressive, right? I'm not talking about that either. I'm talking about us as an operation. So how many more petabytes am I going to grow knowing that 90% of my data is never used again after it's created? How many more disaster recovery exercises and recovery point objective discussions I'm going to have when one or two of these boxes fail? Yeah, so there is a financial implication and an environmental implication of resources that we consume, human and others, right, to be running this machine. And I'm talking about the social as well, because some outcomes of this complex web of entanglement are really bad for people. When you get their address wrong and you reveal maybe to an ex-abusive partner where your previous partner is now living, really bad things happen, right? So it is really important, and it is very much in our social conscious that we get this right. And our governance responsibility, which is to be the only traditional financial institution kind of mandate, right? Well-governed business, because we are managing people's money. So finally, I think the connections are a bit more organic, right? They are a little bit more disorganized and frail. And sometimes if you break one of those links in this web, the web might still be there. But if you break one of the crucial links, it might come apart. So what we are trying to do is experiment more. So since I actually put this slide together, not very many months ago, a few of our experiments didn't go so well, which was the whole point of it, right? You don't have 100% proof of concepts are always proven correct, which is bizarre. So we are focusing on getting data more than copying data. We are understanding new paradigms of mesh or virtualization. We are focusing 100% on making everything we find out visible and consumable in a visible way for our stakeholders. But more than anything, observing metadata from the system as it really is to remain in continuous control, to remain more connected in a timely fashion to what's happening in the system. And I would leave you before questions and answers with just a few food for thought moments. If it hasn't become abundantly clear, we cannot have self-selecting data professionals and non-data professionals, and my quest is to actually make more coalitions and alliances. I want the ugly truth to come about and not necessarily the neat mental models of my architecture diagrams. And I think there is absolute value in this. And finally, the profession of managing information, which is very old, needs to be revived. Yeah, we need to have the data hygiene. You cannot, this is Trinity College in Dublin, and I am told, and I apologize, that this is one of the most inaccessible libraries in the world. You cannot go and get the books that you want, but as a paradigm for indexing, for knowing where things are, for making use of information, you have an abundant, you have centuries of persistent knowledge on paper that has been carefully managed and curated and looked after. And I think we lost our ways when we became digital and so easy and cheap. So for questions, first of all, I want to just remind you all again to do the poll if you can. That will be extremely helpful for me to understand the sentiment and get a sense for how the audience sees challenges in the C-suite. But also a quick mention that we don't have time in our lifetime to learn as much as we need to take the next step if we start from first principles. And it's really important that we are much more interdisciplinary in our learning. And that's why I'm really passionate to just put a few of my favorite books in there as food for thought. If we can learn from authors that came before us from 40s, 50s, all the way to now, I think it can only make us more effective data leaders. And that's it from me, and I would like to open up for questions.
Yeah, so thank you, Simone. Very interesting. I've been to that library actually in Dublin, so it's a wonderful library. Used in a lot of science fiction movies too, apparently. So for our audience, there's a couple of questions in the Huva Q&A that I'm going to ask, but for our virtual audience, please go ahead, and if you want more questions there. Do we have any questions in the audience? Because if so, we will run a microphone to you. So while you think on that, and I'll come back to you, so get your thinking caps on. We do have the first question, Simone, is to what extent do old habits around how to think about and use data end up determining the success of efforts to use data effectively today?
To a great extent, to a huge extent, because the data, how we frame data, is still, it has its gravity in a system or a process. And the way the dialogue happens when you want to use data for a different purpose if it can be used for a different purpose. We could have a whole session on ethics and what is legal and what is ethical. But it shapes the dialogue from the beginning. So the quicker you can detach what is the question you want to answer from the paradigms we think about data, which is system X, right? There are like lots of system names in your organization. I'm absolutely sure of it. There's people said, oh, where do I get the phone numbers? Oh, that's that system, but don't trust there. You have to complement it with the system over here, right? So the conversation is about systems, and that's how we are framing data problems. I think to a huge extent, we leap into a system solution because of that.
Excellent. So before I go to back to the Huva, we have got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Simone. Very nice presentation. One question is, obviously, your example of the production line or the manufacturing flow makes a lot of sense. I like some comments on your experience. You have been with multiple financial institutions, right? Mm-hmm. So a challenge with the analogy of the production line is that a production line, when it exists, is visible. People can see it, can touch it, can visit the factory, right? Which is not the case of a data manufacturing or the data pipeline. Yeah. And the second point is, again, a challenge versus the analogy is that very often in a manufacturing plant, steps are predefined, so are always the same. You can reorganize the layout differently, but the steps are very clearly set. Yeah. In our case, very often, even the same process is described in a completely different way. And probably you have the same situation in multiple of the companies. And again, I'm sure that if we describe our pipeline, our data production line, we'll describe that in 25 different manners if we have 25 people in the room. And we pretend to explain that to people that don't see the production line, don't understand the production line, they're not that interested in the production line. And so the question is, would you share this challenge in itself, and what are your comments?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because this is exactly why I picked up this picture. Because if only, right, if only they were neat, predictable, deterministic workstations. They are not. I don't know where the next droplet might go. You know, there's probably a very complex formula that tells me exactly how this is going to behave. But in financial institutions with layers, it's almost like sediments in an archaeological site, right? You don't quite know where the cracks are. You don't quite know what path things are going to follow. So I think visualization, even if it is one level simplified from what it really is a very good first step. Because without that, you don't have a dialogue. How many times I've sat, and maybe even now, right, I sat on one side, and then I can see, oh my God, the message is not going across, because I can visualize the problem, and the other person cannot. So how can I? And I was really excited to see all the blackboards. I thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't have had slides, and we should have brainstormed on how to visualize things. But I agree the difficulty is there. And the need, I think, is still there to aid communication. There is no point saying it's far too complex, therefore we shouldn't pursue it. So that's more or less where I stand. But I have tried 2 different types of visualization recently. One is I was trying to explain to a colleague who has sent, it's actually not attacking the actual crux of the problem you raised, but just as an example of how creative we need to be. This colleague sent a 4 megabyte PowerPoint that had been PDF'd to 63 people every week. They send a report. So this is I won't say which report because it'll be sensitive. And then I just look, why is this 4 megabytes? Because I open it and it's 2 pages of text, but it's an image of a text from a PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint itself didn't have any text, had a picture. I don't know where do they take the picture from? But it ended up in this 4 megabyte, 2-page document and emailed to everybody. So that I made some calculations, back of the envelope calculations with 7 days worth of email backups. That would go up to about 1.5 gigabytes in the lifetime of that one email. Yeah, 1.5 gigabytes, and that email is sent weekly. I didn't bother to multiply it for the eternity. So I entered a dialogue with this person to say, if you just get the text into a nice HTML or a nice Word document, it's probably about 100K, right? And you save it on your shared location, right? So all these people can access. And I even showed how to really share more efficiently, because people have an aversion of permissioning file by file, whatever, right? And then you calculate the ratio of all the backups ad infinitum. And I don't know what tall building is a good reference or where I am, but the difference in size of the 1.5 gigabyte and the few hundred kilobytes of the second alternative is the ratio between my little card and the Shard in London, which is 310 meters tall. Yeah, so when I drew on a piece of paper a person holding a coffee cup, which was a little dot next to this enormous great building, they realized what this 1.5 gigabyte actually meant. So nobody prescribed this technique or anything. So I'm hoping to have a moment of brilliance where we can apply this kind of visualization down to earth to process with data flowing through them. It's so important to see. I tried water systems and sewage plants. I tried a few other things, but they were a bit too out there, didn't connect, so I wouldn't recommend the sewage problem. I think the other very important, especially for ESG, thing we should all do is to visit a data center, right? To get people to come in and visit I don't know if cloud providers would allow that, but I would like to take my son's school trip to a data center. I say, oh yeah, you see that Christmas list? Over there, just like I'm paying for this iCloud storage over here since that day, right? So I'm trying to really get those visualization moments internalized in a bit off-piste ways.
One more question. I know we've got just a couple of minutes left. So if there are other folks, okay, so let me read out this. This one was an interesting question. It says, what are your thoughts about system design and UI design in enabling better data hygiene and better data quality?
Oh, I love that. Yes, especially because of inclusion, but we could go off piste for too long. Right. But yes, there are behaviors that we will find the easiest way to do something that we either don't feel there's value added, right? And it could be attaching the 4 megabyte thing into an email rather than sharing. It's not that hard, but the user experience, user interface, behavioral analysis, and that care on design of everything we do in that complex system of the cobweb has a huge influence on how we discharge our responsibilities towards data. But we are not considered end users, usually, if you are in the machine, right? If you are a client, you deserve a nicely designed app, right? But if you are part of the operations, you don't really deserve, in the corporate conscious, a well-designed user experience. So it does lead to really awful behaviors, I think, towards data.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Mark, you had a question.
Yes. I used to be the head of global infrastructure and shared services for a couple of large companies, Symantec and Veritas. And the largest line item in my budget, I reported to the CIO, was my storage cost every year. And the conversation that we would have, our budget would get hammered in IT, and storage would stick out like a sore thumb. And your paradigm, your example of the comparison of your piece of paper to the Empire State Building. Yeah. When we talk about that in terms of copy and replication of line of business warehouses or data lakes, of the replication of this data, I think you've opened the door to a really important different position of using the word visualization, right, to help inform collaboration, yeah, to do the cost-effective things in the organization. And I'd just be curious, in your materials that you share from the session, if you could just give us, a frame for that,
Yeah.
because I think that's really key.
Yeah, no, I think we do need a frame. Yes, we do need a frame for that. It is important, it is important that we connect. And I think it's again, I spend some time looking for stuff like this, right? We need to bring people together with common ground, and that frame is not there for us. Yes, you could see storytelling with data. You could read Making Numbers Count. They're wonderful books. And they could help you with one problem or other. But I think we're talking about a much bigger, a greater magnitude of problem, which is data centers are secret, first of all. Problems for IT to resolve behind closed doors in a very expensive way are not visualizable, right? So I will do some digging with the material as well to find some frames for visualization going forwards.
I used to say to the business, the problem is you, not IT.
But then you go back to my techo business. Yeah.
Not our inability to manage.
Well, we can certainly take it offline because we're out of
Oh,
time.
you see, you-
So, yes, indeed. So, Simone Steele from the
Thank you.
Nationwide Building Society UK. Thank you very much indeed for
Thank
coming
you.
over here.
Thank you.
So, will you be around here? Go ahead and play the video. We'll play the video out. So, will you be around here for next?